concerned, Romans and tribespeople, they run into their own women. Here's what Plutarch says, quote, "Those that got safe over, not daring to make head, were slain by the Romans as they fled to their camp and wagons, where the women, meeting them with swords and hatchets, and making a hideous outcry, set upon those who fled, as well as those that pursued. The one as traitors, the other as enemies, and mixing themselves with the combatants, with their bare arms pulling away the Roman shields, and laying hold on their swords, endured the wounds and the slashing of their bodies to the very last with undaunted resolution." End quote. Now, there are stories of women doing this in various kinds of tribes, but the Germans were most known for it. If these Ambrones were Celtic, they may have been doing it, as a tribal custom. They may have picked it up from the Germans, but over and over you will read stories of how the German women do not put up with their men fleeing the battlefield. One of the reasons they're there is to inspire them, and Tacitus, writing, hundreds of years later, will say that the German women still go to the battlefields and yell encouragement on their men, heap abuse on them when they're not doing well, doctor their wounds if they return from the front lines for a while, and at the same time, when the battle's going poorly, scream out what will happen to them if the enemy captures them and mistreats them and hurts their children. And then often, if their men flee anyway, they take up the swords and start, fighting everyone. In this case, Plutarch says that the Ambrones women killed their own men and then took on the Romans too, physically ripping the shields off the Roman legionaries, stopping sword blows by catching the blades with their bare hands. There's almost no way in an ancient battle where the wives and children of one side are actually on the battlefield to avoid a genocidal situation. Not if the, enemy wins. And in this case, the Romans did. And in addition to a lot of Ambrones tribesmen, a lot of women and children died too. Unfortunately for the Romans, there was still a huge army of Teutons in the hills around them, and somewhere nearby, the unconquered Cimbri as well. Plutarch says the Romans weren't even able to make their normal camp at the end of the battle because it's exhausting and people are wounded and you're just trying to pull your own people out from under piles of bodies and recover, don't have time or energy to make a normal camp. They end up having a weird night out there on the battlefield. Plutarch describes it. Quote, "After the Romans were retired from the great slaughter of the Ambrones, night came on. But the army was not indulged, as was the usual custom, with songs of victory, drinking in their tents, and mutual entertainments, and, what is most welcome to soldiers after successful fighting, quiet sleep. But they passed that night, above all others, in fear and alarm, for their camp was without either rampart or palisade, and there remained thousands upon thousands of their enemies yet unconquered, to whom were joined as many of the Ambrones as escaped. There were heard from these, all through the night, wild bewailings, nothing like the sighs and groans of men, but a sort of wild beast-like howling and cursing, joined with threats and lamentations rising from the vast multitude and echoing among the neighboring hills and the hollow banks of the river. The whole plain was filled with hideous noise, insomuch that the Romans were not a little afraid, and Marius himself was apprehensive of a confused, tumultuous night engagement. But the enemy did not stir either this night or the next day, but were employed in disposing and drawing themselves up to the greatest advantage." End quote. So these Romans, trying to get what sleep they can, with bandages and trying to cook food among groaning, wounded, and heaps of corpses and the most hideous sights you can imagine. And this whole time, the tribal enemy is screaming and howling in the hills and threatening, and the sound is echoing amongst the plains with all these dead bodies everywhere, and ghosts seemingly haunting the whole thing. There are lots of examples in history where small groups of people can get trapped by tribesmen who are in the hills, and you can hear the drums beating, and there's this ominous sense of foreboding. Rarely do you have a situation where you have an army of tens of thousands of killers frightened for their lives, because an even bigger army is in the hills surrounding them, screaming threats and wailing and howling to the moon, essentially. Must have made the hair on the back of the neck of every one of these Italian soldiers stand up. And you wonder how much the Romans would have been worrying about what would happen if they fell into the hands of the people that were screaming this time, the ancient geographer Strabo would write about what the Cimbri did to prisoners, and one gets a pretty good feeling that rumors and all sorts of imaginings must have been making their way through the Roman campfires and the ranks, the scuttlebutt of what the enemy they're fighting were like. Here's what the ancient geographer Strabo writes about the Cimbri and how they dealt with prisoners of war. Their wives, who would accompany them on their expeditions, were attended by priestesses, who were seers. These were gray-haired, clad in white, with flaxen cloaks fastened on with clasps, girt with girdles of bronze, and barefooted. Now, sword in hand, these priestesses would meet with the prisoners of war throughout the camp, and having first crowned them with wreaths, would lead them to a brazen vessel of about 20 amphorae. And they had a raised platform which the priestess would mount, and then bending over the kettle, they would cut the throat of each prisoner after he'd been lifted up. And from the blood that poured forth into the vessel, some of the priestesses would draw a prophecy, while still others would split open the body, and from an inspection of the entrails would utter a prophecy of victory for their own people. And during the battle, they would beat on the hides that were stretched over the wicker bodies of the wagon, and in this way produce an unearthly noise. It would be better to die fighting these people than to fall into their hands. Plutarch says, again, if you can believe him, he goes into so much more depth than people like Appian and some of the other sources for these battles, but he says that while waiting for the Teutons to essentially come to the battle and fight, Marius occupies himself finding places to lay ambushes, places to hide his men, and he finds a steep, wooded valley where he can hide 3,000 of his soldiers in a place that will eventually be in the rear when the tribesmen attack. And then he puts the rest of his soldiers on a bit of a sloped hill, so that when the Teutons attack, they'll have to attack uphill. And then to make sure that they attack, when they appear, he has his cavalry go down and taunt them and tempt them, which is more than the tribesmen's ego would allow them to handle. Plutarch says that everything worked as planned. The Teutons arrived, they charged the Roman cavalry, they ran up the hill, were facing the Roman legionaries waiting for them. They were already getting the worst of it when what was left of the Ambrones charges and tries to turn the situation around. And that's when Marius unleashes those 3,000 men he has hidden in the rear, and the great slaughter begins. Plutarch says, quote, "For Marcellus had not let slip the opportunity, but as soon as the shout was raised among the Romans on the hills, he, setting his men in motion, fell upon the enemy behind at full speed and with loud cries, and routed those nearest him. And they, breaking the ranks of those that were before them, filled the whole army with confusion. They made no long resistance after they were thus broken in upon, but having lost all order, fled. The Romans," Plutarch says, "pursuing them, slew and took prisoners above 100,000, and possessing themselves of their spoil, tents and carriages." He says that the inhabitants of that region made fences around their vineyards with the bones, and that the ground was so saturated with rotting corpses, soaked with the rain of the following winter, he says, that the next season yielded a prodigious crop. The Teutons were defeated, and with them their allies, the Ambrones, and now the menace of the Cimbri was what was left. As the battle cleanup goes on, and as Marius and his troops are assembling this giant pile of loot and booty and arms and armor taken from the defeated enemy, Plutarch's horsemen are seen riding up from the distance to Marius and his officers who are in their celebratory mood. And by the way, we have to trust Plutarch for all this stuff, because all of the other historians talking about this make it a very short comment. Gaius Marius went to this area in this year, defeated the Teutons in battle. It's Plutarch, who's really more of a biographer than a historian, who goes into depth on this stuff, and hopefully he was working from libraries and records that we don't have anymore. But he says that these horsemen rode up to Marius and informed him of the good news that he'd been elected consul once again, this time for the 5th time. And what's happened over the last several years in Roman history is that the Romans have felt so threatened by enemies, first the Jugurthan guerrillas, and then these tribesmen who were literally going to roll over Rome, that they didn't want to take any chances with untried leadership, so they stuck with the force that they knew could get the job done, this can-do guy, Gaius Marius. But it warped the Roman system to violate the Constitution popular dictator simply because he's the only one that people trust to deliver them from these terrible threats. And there's still one more on the horizon. The Cimbri. While Marius is celebrating his 5th consulship, the other consul at this time period, who's a guy named Catulus, is trying to hold another pass, another entrance into Italy. And that's the one the Cimbris decide to try to push through. Catulus has as one of his sub-commanders Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla was working in Marius's army at this time, but he kept feeling like anything that he did that was creditable was being written off by Marius. Marius probably still jealous, the sources indicate, for what happened in North Africa. So Sullus transfers to Catulus's force and is doing great, wondrous things over there, the sources say. Supplying the troops in wonderful fashion, just being a fantastic officer. But what happens to poor Catulus is they become the army that the Cimbri decide to go after. They leave Marius alone, not knowing, apparently, of what happened to their brethren, the Teutons, and they attack the pass being guarded by Catulus. Now, Catulus and his troops have had time to fortify this area. They station their forces behind the river. They build up, if you think the Roman camp is strong and powerful, imagine something that they've had weeks and weeks and weeks to put together with timbers and all sorts of. They basically have a castle out there in the hills guarding this pass from this threat that's just rolled over all these other Roman armies. Plutarch tells us what happens right in front of the astonished eyes of Catulus's legionaries. Plutarch says the barbarians were not afraid of a strong defensive position. Quote, "The barbarians, however, came on with such insolence and contempt of their enemies that to show their strength and courage, rather than out of any necessity, they went naked in the showers of snow, and through the ice and deep snow climbed up to the tops of the hills, and from thence, placing their broad shields under their body, let themselves slide down from the precipices along their vast, slippery descents." End quote. What Plutarch is saying is that this is an intimidation factor. These barbarians, for no need, simply strip off all their clothes in front of the Romans and run around in the snowdrifts naked, as if to say, this doesn't bother us. They take their shields and in an ancient form of like snowboarding, slalom down the hills on them, again, in front of the Romans. This is all part of, the same sort of thing you would see when the Miami Dolphins will go play the Green Bay Packers in the middle of winter, and the Packers will all go out on the field in -5-degree temperatures with no undershirts on. So they're saying, is this bothering you? It's not bothering us. Plutarch says that when the Cimbri surveyed this strong Roman defensive position behind the river with a little bridge the Romans had built over it, and their strong fortifications on the other side, they simply decided to eliminate it. This is Plutarch now talking about this. Quote, "When they," meaning the Cimbri, "had pitched their camp at a little distance from the river, and surveyed the passage," meaning the river, "they began to pile it up, giant-like, tearing down the neighboring hills, and brought trees pulled up by the roots, and heaps of earth down to the river, damming up its course, and with great heavy materials, which they rolled down the stream and dashed against the bridge, they forced away the beams which supported it, in consequence of which the greatest part of the Roman soldiers, much affrighted, left the camp and fled. Here Catulus," Plutarch writes, "showed himself a generous and noble general, in preferring the glory of his people before his own. For when he could not prevail with his soldiers to stand to their colors, but saw how they all deserted him, he commanded his own standard to be taken up, and running to the foremost of those that fled, he led them forward, choosing rather that the disgrace should fall upon himself than upon his country, and that they should not seem to fly, but following their captain to make a retreat." End quote. What Plutarch is saying is that when the Roman soldiers started running away, worried that this would make the Roman people scared and frightened and ashamed and worried, Catulus grabs his standard, runs to the front of the fleeing soldiers, and makes it look like he's leading them away in an ordered retreat, so that the Romans will blame him for being a cowardly general, as opposed to worrying that yet another legion had fled in terror from these monstrous beings from the north. Plutarch paints it as a patriotic retreat, I guess you could say. The sources say that the Cimbri began to just lay waste to all the surrounding land, which prompted calls for help, which prompted Caius Marius to arrive on the scene. And he joins with the army of Catulus, and he decides to make a defense against the Cimbri tribesmen. He has to keep them from breaking into Italy, or, Rome's in terrible trouble. That's the threat they've been trying to avoid these several years, that all these legions have been going up against these tribes. Don't let them into Italy, and now they're right on the verge, and here comes Marius to save the day once again, seen as the only man who could do it at the time. This is why he keeps getting elected to the consulship. He's the indispensable figure in this story. Plutarch writes that ambassadors were sent from the Cimbri to Marius, and that the ambassadors were talking about their brethren who were going to arrive soon, and if they didn't get what they wanted, the two together would combine and deal with the Romans. Plutarch says, quote, "When Marius inquired of the ambassadors who their brethren were, upon saying the Teutons, all that were present," meaning all the Roman officers around Marius, "began to laugh, and Marius scoffingly answered them, 'Do not trouble yourself for your brethren, for we've already provided lands for them, which they shall possess forever.' The ambassadors," Plutarch says, "understanding the mockery, broke into insults, and threatened that the Cimbri would make them pay for this, and the Teutons too, when they came. 'They're not far off,' replied Marius, 'and it will be unkindly done of you to go away before greeting your brethren.' Saying so," Plutarch writes, "he commanded the king of the Teutons to be brought out, as they were, in chains, for they were taken by the Sequani, among the Alps, before they could make their escape. This was no sooner made known to the Cimbri, but they with all expedition came against Marius, who then lay still and guarded his camp." End quote. That's one of the greatest moments related in all of Plutarch. And you hope it's real, because the drama's incredible, this idea that the Cimbri would come to him all arrogantly, demanding something, and he has, limited time before their brethren arrive, and these two German tribes, or whatever nationality tribes, 300,000 fighting men are just going to lay waste to these Romans, as they've done several times already. And Marius, ice water in his veins, the CEO of Rome Inc., laughs at them and says, "We've already provided permanent ground for your people in the ground. And, oh yeah, I happen to have a few of their prominent people right here in chains." I mean, if he really had them in chains for just that moment, this was a guy with a real flair for the dramatic. What a wonderful story. And then Plutarch goes on to say that the minute that happens, it's on. And now you get to face the full might of these tribes that just had struck fear into the hearts of Rome for now going on a decade, and the Cimbri appear on the battlefield. Now, the battlefield also contains another important person. Our friend Lucius Cornelius Sulla was at this battle, and apparently had written something about it, because Plutarch quotes him in a few cases as a primary participant in this showdown of a fight. This is what Plutarch writes about the beginning of the battle as the two sides begin deploying. Quote, "They observed the time appointed and drew out their forces against each other. Catulus commanded 20,300 and Marius 32,000, who were placed in the two wings, leaving Catulus in the center. Sulla, who was present for the fight, gives this account, saying also that Marius drew up his army in this order because he expected that the armies would meet on the wings, since it generally happens that in such extensive fronts the center falls back, and thus he would have the whole victory to himself and his soldiers, and Catulus would not even be engaged." He continues. "They tell us also that Catulus himself alleged this in vindication of his honor, accusing in various ways the enviousness of Marius." End quote. What that's saying, ladies and gentlemen, is that Gaius Marius, this hyper-ambitious figure, literally deployed his army to maximize his chances of personally, gaining glory in the battle. Forget about winning the battle against this amazing foe. Plutarch is saying that his ambition was so intense that he's organizing his troops to make sure, aha, if I organize them this way, Catulus won't get any of the glory because his wing will never come into contact, and my wing will come into contact first, allowing me to have all the glory. I mean, that is conniving for domestic advantage while you're sitting here facing a life or death threat on a battlefield. That's amazing. Plutarch continues, quote, "The infantry of the Cimbri marched out quietly out of their fortifications, having their flanks equal to their front, every side of the army taking up 30 furlongs. Their horse, that were in number 15,000, made a very splendid appearance. They wore helmets made to resemble the head and jaws of wild beasts, and other strange shapes, and heightening these with plumes of feathers, they made themselves appear taller than they were. They had breastplates of iron and white glittering shields, and for their offensive arms every one had 2 darts, and when they came hand to hand, they used large heavy swords. End quote. Now, in religious sources, one of the things that this battle will actually hinge upon are the weather conditions. And that's always something that's a major variable in warfare. In this case, Plutarch makes it seem like the weather made all the difference in the world. Because the Germanic barbarians had come so far south now, they were so close to Italy, that they'd entered a different sort of weather zone. And it was the height of summer. And these people that 150 years from now, Tacitus will say, grow up in forests that are so dark because the trees all touch at the top of the canopy that they never even see any light growing up, are now in the heat of a Roman summer. Even if it's in northern Italy, in the Alps, it's still, to them, extremely hot. You're on a dusty plain, and the dust starts whipping around, and it goes into barbarians' faces, and it bothers the Romans too, but according to Plutarch, it's almost an advantage, because they can't see very far in front of them, so the huge numbers, he says, of the barbarians can't scare the hell out of them because they can't see them. They can only see the first couple of ranks right in front of them, implying that if they could see how many of the enemy they faced, they would likely do what Catulus' army had done not that long ago and turn around and flee. The weather conditions begin to weigh on a kingdom. Here's what Plutarch says. Quoting Sulla, in the engagement, according to the accounts of Sulla and his friends, Marius met with what might be called a mark of divine displeasure, for a great dust being raised, which, as it might very probably happen, almost covered both the armies. He, leading on his forces to the pursuit, missed the enemy, and having passed by their array, moved for a good space up and down the field. Meanwhile, the enemy, by chance, engaged with Catulus, and in the heat of battle was chiefly with him and his men, among whom Sulla says he was, adding that the Romans had great advantage of the heat and sun that shone in the faces of the Cimbri. For they, well able to endure cold, and having been bred up, as we observed before, in cold and shady countries, were overcome with the excessive heat. They sweated extremely, and they were much out of breath, being forced to hold their shields before their faces, for the battle was fought not long after the summer solstice, or as the Romans reckoned, upon the third day before the new moon of the month now called August. End quote. Now, it's a little hard to follow Plutarch sometimes, because just a moment ago, he had the Cimbri slaloming down frozen hillsides and going naked in the snow showers, and now he's got this heat tearing him down. But remember, they were in the Alps before, now they've moved towards northern Italy, and they're out of the big mountain passes, so that explains the difference in the weather conditions. For a long time, it was believed that this battle happened on the field of battle where Hannibal first defeated the Romans after coming out of the Alps. There's some disagreement now among historians whether that's the actual site. In any case, it becomes one of the most important battles during this whole time period. Plutarch continues about the battle, where he talks about the crucial fighting going on in the center of the battle line, where here the Germans, in order to stand firm, maybe you consider it a pledge with something to hold people to it. He says that the Germans have chained themselves together in the front lines, man after man after man, running a heavy iron chain through each other's belts so that they couldn't flee. He says, talking about the battle going on in the center, quote, here the greatest part and most valiant of the enemies were cut in pieces. For those that fought in the front, that they might not break their ranks, were fast tied to one another, with long chains put through their belts. But as they pursued those that fled to their camp, they witnessed a most fearful tragedy. The women, standing in black clothes on their wagons, slew all that fled, some their husbands, some their brethren, others their fathers, and strangling their little children with their own hands, threw them under the wheels and the feet of the cattle, and then killed themselves. They tell of one who hung herself from the end of the pole of a wagon, with her children tied dangling at her heels. The men, for want of trees, tied themselves to some of the horns of the oxen, others by the neck to their legs, so that pricking them on, by the starting and springing of the beasts, they might be torn or trodden to pieces. Yet for all they thus massacred themselves, above 60,000 were taken prisoner, and those that were slain were said to be twice as many. End quote. So once again, you see that phenomenon of these tribal women waiting at the far edge of the battlefield. And once the battle is decided, and one side turns and runs back toward their camp, the women do what they did in the previous battle, and they pick up their weapons, and they kill everyone running towards them, and then they kill themselves. It's Armageddon as far as these two tribes are concerned. And 150 or so years later, when Tacitus writes his piece about the German peoples, he'll talk about a small remnant